Welcome to this explainer. Today we're digging into a massive historical irony. How Rome's supposedly brilliant strategic decision to outsource its border defense actually paved the way for the empire's spectacular collapse. Let's get right into it.
So, how exactly does the greatest military machine of the ancient world basically defeat itself? It's a simple but absolutely fascinating question, right?
Section 1. The Overextended Empire.
To really understand Rome's vulnerability, you've got to wrap your head around the staggering scale of their territory. We're talking about a 5 million square kilometer empire. That immense size created an absolute logistical nightmare, and it highlighted a huge split in their military strategy. On one side, you have the mighty Roman legions. These guys were incredibly powerful, sure, but they were painfully slow. They only marched a few hours a day and constantly had to stop and dig camp trenches. On the flip side, Rome desperately needed fast, agile auxiliary troops to handle quick, sporadic border raids. The legions weren't an unstoppable force, absolutely, but their severe lack of mobility meant they literally couldn't be everywhere at once.
So how do you optimize a frontier that massive? Well, they tried a few things. They built Hadrian's Wall at the absolute narrowest point of Britain just to save on manpower. They relied heavily on rivers to act as natural borders, which made for super efficient boat patrols. And in some parts of the West, they actually just left the perimeters totally empty. They relied entirely on the psychological terror of the Roman name to keep enemies away. But let's be real, physically defending every single inch of that border with Roman citizens was just mathematically impossible.
Moving on to Section 2, Friends, Clients, and Buffers. Because they were so insanely overextended, Rome had to get creative. They adopted an asymmetrical solution. Instead of directly annexing their neighbors, they started using nearby kings and tribes for cheap border security. The key to all this was a Roman concept called amicitia. Basically, it was an elite idea of friendship and reciprocal obligation, but they applied it diplomatically to client kings. It was a pretty clever setup, honestly. It let Rome call the shots and extract military support, entirely avoiding the massive headache of deploying slow legions or setting up direct governors.
A perfect example of this strategy in action is Armenia. Armenia acted as this incredibly vital neutral buffer state sandwiched right between the Roman Empire and the highly hostile Parthian Empire. By using Armenia this way, Rome kept its Syrian and Anatolian borders safe, and they totally bypassed the enormous logistical cost of a direct occupation. But, as you might guess, this strategy carried a ton of risk. To make their administration easier, Roman diplomats loved to prop up singular, first-among-equals figures, someone like Cartimandua of the Brigantes tribe, and elevate them into full-blown autocrats. It was just way easier than dealing with a bickering council. The catch? Ignoring tribal consensus and forcing this artificial top-down hierarchy onto their clients almost always sparked the exact rebellions Rome was trying to avoid in the first place.
Which brings us to Section 3, the Palmyrene Rebellion.
Let's jump ahead to the year 260 CE. This is where we see a breathtaking disaster unfold because a heavily armed client state decides to go completely rogue. The speed of this crisis is just wild. First, you have the Palmyrene king, Odenathus, bravely stepping up to protect Rome's eastern flank from Persia. But then he dies. His widow, Zenobia, takes over as regent in 267 CE. And what does she do? She immediately takes that delegated Roman military power, marches down, and conquers Egypt's vital grain supply just 3 years later.
Zenobia went on an absolute tear. She successfully carved out an independent realm, capturing Antioch and Asia Minor. At her peak, she controlled a staggering 1/3 of Rome's total territory and tax revenue. She was even minting her own coins, styling herself as Augusta, all while running a highly effective bilingual administration in Aramaic and Greek. It was the ultimate wake-up call, proving definitively that outsourced buffer states could instantly morph into existential threats if you gave them too much autonomy.
Naturally, the empire had to respond, and it wasn't easy. It took the battle-hardened Emperor Aurelian securing the Danube, marching his army all the way across Anatolia to Syria, and pulling off a brilliant tactical feint at the Battle of Imme. He essentially tricked Zenobia's formidable heavy cavalry into exhausting their horses by chasing a fake retreat. Finally, Rome crushed her disorganized forces, besieged Palmyra, and put an end to the 5-year rebellion.
All right, Section 4, Rise of the Foederati.
So, Zenobia was defeated, but Rome was still in serious trouble. Thanks to declining tax revenues and the capital moving over to Constantinople, the Western Empire was desperately bleeding manpower and money. They couldn't even rely on simple client kings anymore. They had to pivot, leaning heavily on what they called Foederati.
These were entire barbarian tribes, like the Franks and Goths, who were literally settled directly inside Roman borders, specifically so they could serve as mercenaries for the empire.
It's fascinating to see how Rome's payment methods evolved over the centuries. Back in the Republic, they paid allied states, the Soci, with Roman citizenship. In the early empire, it was autonomy for those client kings. But by the late empire, the Roman treasury was practically empty. Lacking the actual gold to pay professional, standing armies, Rome's solution was basically just to hand over billets and land, allowing armed barbarian tribes to permanently settle on Roman territory in exchange for their swords.
And wow, did this outsourcing strategy backfire spectacularly? Fast forward to 378 CE. A group of Gothic Foederati, who had originally just sought refuge south of the Danube but were subjected to terrible Roman abuses, decided they'd had enough. They launched a massive revolt and absolutely crushed Emperor Valens at the Battle of Adrianople. It was a catastrophic, unrecoverable loss of core Roman military manpower. From that point on, Rome had no choice but to rely almost exclusively on these incredibly unreliable Foederati levies.
To give you an idea of just how hollowed out the Roman military actually became, check this out. General Stilicho literally had to use Huns to defeat the Vandals. General Aetius, he secured Gaul using a massive force of, you guessed it, Huns. And when Rome finally faced the legendary Attila the Hun in 451, they had to rely entirely on a coalition of Visigoths, Franks, and Alans to stop him. By the time we hit the 5th century, Rome's survival basically boiled down to paying one group of barbarians to fight off another group of barbarians.
Which brings us to Section 5, the outsourced collapse.
Here is the ultimate tragic irony of it all. Throughout the 3rd and 4th centuries, there was this massive fatal disconnect right at the heart of the empire. The Roman Senate was sitting back, treating military strategy as this abstract, theoretical thought experiment, supposedly guided by rational choice. They were completely detached from the gritty, boots-on-the-ground realities of the battlefield. They entirely failed to realize that their actual front lines weren't Roman anymore. They were literally controlled by autonomous, barbarian warlords.
And that naturally leads us right to the year 476 CE, the definitive, undeniable end of the Western Roman Empire.
In 476, an outsourced Foederati commander named Odoacer essentially just looked around, did the math, and realized Rome had absolutely zero real power left. So what did he do? He easily deposed the Western Emperor, Romulus Augustulus, claimed Italy for himself, packed up the imperial insignia, and shipped it right off to Constantinople. Just like that, independent barbarian kingdoms formally replaced Roman administration. Rome was literally finished off by its own hired sword.
So, as we wrap up this explainer on the dangerous cost of control, we want to leave you with one final, pretty unsettling thought based on this incredible historical parallel. When you look at how Rome willingly traded direct military readiness for the seemingly cheaper, easier option of proxy forces, you have to ask yourself, are modern superpowers making the exact same outsourcing mistakes today? Thanks for exploring this topic with us, and we'll catch you in the next explainer.